lots of reasons, both technological and economic, as well as fundamentally business reasons why this change is happening. But I think you can boil it down to a story of two laws. One law is the famous Moore's Law, which I'm sure all of you, or at least most of you, are very familiar with, enunciated by Gordon Moore, an Intel engineer back in the 1960s. And he observed that the power of computing at a given price would double essentially every year or two, every 18 months. And ever since then, that law has basically held true. And if you look at how computing power has gone up at a given price, and what this means is computing gets much, much cheaper, incredibly cheaper over the years, this Moore's Law explains the explosion of applications, the explosion of investment in IT, the explosion of complexity. Then there's another law that many fewer people have heard of, also enunciated by a guy at Intel, Andy Grove, the old CEO of Intel, who in the 1990s said, well, the capacity of a data communications network only doubles about every century. And he meant it as a dig at telephone companies, telecommunications companies, because he thought they were dragging their feet in modernizing, updating their networks. But nevertheless, it gets across a fundamental point that explains a lot about how we've thought about information technology until very recently. And that is, if you wanted to tap into all the new things that were made possible by Moore's Law in the ever-cheapening, the ever-accelerating rate of price drops of computing, the only way to do it was to build it yourself. Because there was no network that could deliver the kind of sophisticated services that your company or even your household demanded from their computers. This finally all began to change in the last 10, 15, 20 years when telecommunications companies and many other companies began to make huge investments in their data communication networks, laying lots of fiber optic cable. And the upshot is essentially that Grove's Law has been repealed. And finally, the capacity of the network, the capacity of the grid, is beginning to equal the effective capacity of the computer itself. And when that happens, everything we know about IT changes. Suddenly, all the old assumptions that you had to build it yourself, you had to run it yourself, you had to invest your capital, your company's capital, in this resource, gets thrown out the window. Because suddenly we have a new way to distribute very, very sophisticated IT functions, IT capacities, and that is the utility networked cloud model of IT supply. I still think the best kind of overall explanation of what we're seeing comes from something that Eric Schmidt said back in 1993. Eric Schmidt, now the former CEO of Google. Back in 1993, I think he was the chief technology officer of Sun Microsystems, a company that has since gone out of business. Very good at, Sun Microsystems, extremely good at foreseeing the future, but extremely poor at turning that into business opportunities, and thus has disappeared from the scene. But back then, Eric Schmidt said, when the network becomes as fast as the processor, the computer hollows out and spreads across the network. And that is fundamentally what we're seeing today. What we